So here we go with part 2 in 3, 2, and 1.
I'm Deacon Eric.
And I'm Dr. Brett Sockel.
And you're listening to Thinking Faith.
This is a podcast brought to you by the Archdiocese of Regina, where we attempt to navigate this winding road of faith in Jesus Christ so that we might know Him more intimately, love Him more profoundly, and together serve Him more deeply in our daily lives.
Welcome, everyone, to another week of Thinking Faith as we continue this delightful conversation with Amanda Ackman, who is visiting our Archdiocese through the course of this last week in March, though you at home will be seeing this a little bit later on. But we're very happy to continue this discussion. We ended last week talking about a particular project that you've been working on for a few years now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Dying to Meet You project, which I find one of the more fascinating and compelling approaches that you have to this. And so we're going to share a few stories in this episode that flow out of that work that you've been doing and the fascinating people that you've been able to connect with through that project.
But start by telling us about the name, because I think that's a super catchy, compelling name, Dying to Meet You.
Sure. It's really a story that started all in the months that I was working in politics. And so I had been working with a member of parliament trying to prevent the legislative expansion of euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness. I returned from 2 years of studying in Poland. This was shortly after my grandfather died that I moved to Poland, and I studied John Paul II philosophical studies at the Catholic University of Lublin. And while I was there studying the philosophy of JP2 in Poland, especially Polish people would ask, what on earth do you plan to do with that? And I always said, well, hopefully I will humanize the culture. So I returned to Canada and I started working with an excellent member of parliament. And within this context, it was not long before, fewer than 5 years after legalization, and even before the statutory review, the government was already planning to expand euthanasia even further because once legalized, euthanasia cannot remain limited. It will always be expanded on the grounds of equality. So that's what was happening. And my main work in the years that I worked in Ottawa was to try and mount resistance to this expansion. However, we knew that we were outnumbered in politics, in parliament. Yeah. And so it was very difficult for us to work with the spirit of detachment from the result, knowing that this meant death for many, many more Canadians, and that this amounted to a devaluation of people with disabilities, of any kind of mental health challenge. It was very, very painful. And it was around this time, having reflected so deeply on John Paul II, that I was praying and I thought, wow, it's almost that we don't so much have a culture of death in Canada as we seem to have death with no culture. Mm-hmm. Death with no culture at all. And I started to think again about personal responsibility. How can I take personal responsibility in light of this political defeat in order to bring some cultural renewal to death and dying? And so it was while I was still working in politics that I thankfully had the freedom to start a personal blog as my own catharsis. And I called it Dying to Meet You. And it was dyingtomeetyou.ca. So everything's archived at that former site. It was a WordPress site, very simple website. Yeah. And it started as my own really catharsis about the political situation. So on January 1st, 2021, I made a resolution, I was 30 years old, to blog about death every single day for the entire year. 365 days, every single day, not missing a day. And I did it. I remember on the third day, I was like, what have I committed to? And there are 3 people reading this right now. Oh, what have I really gotten myself into? But gradually, the blog became so fruitful, more than I could have imagined. There were more than 15,000 unique readers throughout the year. And more than simply reading the blog, people were changing their life because of the stories that were being shared. I don't think I mentioned euthanasia that entire year. I was entirely focused on a positive aspirational lens toward suffering and death that dealt with the real grit of life, that was not facile or superficial, not at all, but that looked toward these realities as a basis for communion and depth and meaning. And so it became my highlight of every day. I was happiest when I was contending with these topics, and it was still in the midst of the pandemic. So it also gave me an occasion to go out of myself, think about something else, review my camera roll from trips I had gone on, and write about death across different cultures and civilizations, which I was doing all the time, which was super energizing as well. Like I remember I'd pull up, I needed a topic. It was always, what am I going to do for the blog? And everyone knew that I was doing this project. So they would also send me articles all throughout that year. And that just became such a great basis for friendship and communication with people toward the end of the pandemic time. And so I remember, looking in my camera roll and seeing that when I was in the museums throughout Europe, I would come across these ancient Greek funerary monuments, and I really liked them. I was captivated, and what struck me about the ancient Greek funerary monuments in these European museums was that they often depicted a family scene altogether, like a family dining scene, rather than an individual tombstone. And I started to wonder, well, what would it be like if your family plot and tombstone depicted a dining scene? What would you be eating? Would there be phones on the table? Who would you have as your guests along with your family, maybe in your home as well? What traditional recipes? All of this. And so I blogged about that. Or I remember being in Mexico and seeing that the cemeteries were so colorful.
Yeah.
And so I would write, well, the most colorful cemetery that I've ever visited. And each time it was honestly, I can describe it no other way than absolutely life-giving to me. And it was during that year that the 3 interns in the political office in which I was working, they intended to get me a skull as a little memento mori for my desk, because they thought there's no birthday gift for a 30th birthday more fitting for the Dying to Meet You blogger than a little skull. But the thing is, it was the pandemic. They went on Amazon to order a skull, and they found out, and there were 3 men, so they, of course, were last minute in their Amazon Prime order. Well, they ordered a life-size skull. And it was only last year that I was bringing that memento mori gift from Ottawa back to Calgary. And as soon as I got back to Calgary, I opened the suitcase to find a note that said, your bag has been inspected and everything has been put back. So if you travel with
in this bag.
a plastic skull, you may have your bag searched by our Canadian security of luggage inspection. So yeah, basically this familiarity really came about through that year of blogging. And I knew I wanted the blog to have this positive aspirational framing. I knew that I wanted it to include the word death or dying so that we actually face up to the reality, because at a time of euphemisms and acronyms like MAID for medical assistance in dying, which is euthanasia, which is already a euphemism to begin with. So in a time of euphemism upon euphemism and so many acronyms and then multiplication of acronyms in French, working on Parliament Hill, I really wanted to say death and dying and to speak about this. And then I really wanted it to have a dimension of relationality and to especially focus on how so much of it involved interviews or just that outward going look toward others, other people, other customs. I wrote a lot about Jewish, and also wherever I was, there was a time toward the very end of that year. I ended my year of blogging in Turkey. And so some of the last blogs are about being at Rumi's tomb and then being in a Muslim cemetery in Konya in Turkey. So I had this really expansive lens toward these realities. And yeah, I've always found that the times in cemeteries, for example, conversations walking through a cemetery with friends, or even just praying as I walk through a cemetery, having conversations about ultimate things of eternal significance. To me, this is all this is our very life. It's worth it.
I thought one of the money quotes from the first episode was when you were talking about how you came to the realization, in light of what the vocations director had said about where your passion meets the world's needs, when you realized that passion wasn't just what you're good at or what excites you, but what suffering you're undergoing. And just to make the connection between, it was the suffering you were undergoing that led you to this blog project
Yeah.
that ended up being so life-giving. It's the gospel paradox of the seed that falls. You know, unless it dies, it remains a single grain. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, we have this metaphor in a 20 different ways in the gospel, but that basic idea. And I was really struck by that part of episode 1, and so just to see that was how that had played out very practically in this story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too. The you talked about the concern at the front end, like day 3, about how I'm going to fill these 365 days. But then when you started talking about imagining death or looking at death in different cultures, I'm like, that's an endless well to draw
material.
from, because people die in every culture.
In fact,
It's
I
the-
thought about it as like some people would say, how are you going to write about death every day? And I said the same way they print newspapers every day.
Yeah. That happens. That was our concern when we started the podcast.
The podcast. And we're going to
We're
run
like-
out of material. We had ideas for maybe 20 episodes. And then, like, what are you going to do after that? You know, and we're at, like, what are we at?
450 now.
Something like that.
That's great.
Something ridiculous, but
One of the things that strikes me is your unflinching sort of look at death you feel, I don't know how well it's coming across on the camera, you feel very alive.
yes.
And-
I was thinking about that with the first episode. I'm
And
like,
a lot of our culture that refuses to look at death does not feel alive.
yeah.
And that strikes me. And one of the things that we talked about before the show to go into is like, how do we challenge one another to face this reality, to face death? And in particular, we talk about like, what do we do with children, right? So one of the things that occurred to me in my life, like I have 7 kids, we read books. And there's this great tradition in children's literature of an animal dying, right? Old Yeller, is it Where the Red Fern Grows? Does that have an animal dying?
Yeah.
My Side of the Mountain. Like there's all these stories, right, where a child befriends an animal and then the animal dies. And I think as a culture, I don't have the stats on this, but I think as a culture, those books, which were very popular when I was growing up in the 80s, and they made movies about them, and everyone knew those stories, they've become less and less popular. And in fact, there have even been explicit, like, we're taking these out of the curriculum because they might be traumatizing in certain contexts. And I just think we've missed the actual social and psychological function of stories about death for children, where animals are very often like the way in. Charlotte's Web,
Yeah.
right? Which is really interesting because on the one hand, Wilbur is saved.
Yeah.
So it's a story about Wilbur's death, or you think it's going to be,
Yeah.
or the worry about that, and then it ends up being a story about Charlotte's.
But when you put it that way, I mean, the whole story has death hovering from beginning to end.
Right. And it's
Right?
one of the
In
greatest children's books of all time. And death is like a central theme. And we've become paranoid about presenting this to children. And I think it's a great disservice. Like there was real wisdom in that tradition that I think we've completely lost. And so I wonder, let's talk a little about those kinds of things, but maybe thoughts on.
Well, I know that was one of the things that struck me in the first episode as well, was so often we avoid conversations around death and dying because we think it's a morbid topic and it brings everything down. But as we're discussing, I mean, like Brett said, I mean, you are full of energy and alive, and it reminded me a lot of my experiences in parish ministry, and the struggles it was to get altar servers to serve at funerals in the parish. They had a long-standing relationship with the schools that if we had a funeral during the day, students would receive permission to come out. We never had a struggle with the kids themselves wanting to serve funerals. It was most often parents who would either object or just say, no, I don't want my child to be involved in this. And I found it was a real struggle to try to explain to parents how actually untraumatizing being at funerals and serving at funerals is for children. Having been the pastoral assistant, my kids usually ended up serving a number of those funerals. And to this day, they have a very different approach to the whole process of death and dying. We've been able to have conversations, when my kids were 10 and 12 years old on the way home from funerals about, largely what not to do in a eulogy. It would be one of the big things where we're like, okay, so when dad dies, don't start with when dad's great grandparents came over on the boat, and tell out the whole story. But like to have those conversations very frankly and honestly, but with a little bit of life and humor and stuff that I think a lot of people miss out on.
Yeah, great points all around. I'm reminded of a quotation of Flannery O'Connor where she says, "You cannot love what shocks you." And that speaks to the need for a kind of familiarity with death and dying and also suffering and accompaniment and what goes into it. I think about how when I was about 10, when my other grandfather died, and I remember being at that funeral, being very close to the whole experience. It's a standout memory. I don't remember what I was learning in school at the time, but I remember that because death brings us to the real and the essential. And so in that way, it's such a gift to give children exposure to what is essential.
It's real.
And real.
And real.
And I have a friend of mine who really kind of diagnoses euthanasia as a kind of symptom of our social media age as well. And she says, if your whole life has been a reel, R-E-E-L, then your death might not be real, R-E-A-L. And so in a sense, trying to curate this perfect image and banishing anything that doesn't kind of fit the script ends up shattering life of its real meaning. And when people wonder, well, how do you speak about these topics in a secular society? How are you able to address people who don't share the faith and views about heaven and eternal life and things like this? And I say, well, first of all, there's no good story without suffering. Doesn't mean we need to seek it. As one writer says, like, we don't need to go seeking suffering. Enough is as good as a feast, but those who do not know how to suffer can never grow up, can never discover who and what we are. And so my appeal for those who want to kind of contribute to a cultural renewal in this space is invite someone, anyone, to speak about who they admire and why. And I guarantee you that there will be some overcoming, resilience, triumph over ordeals in the story. Otherwise, what's the basis for admiration?
Yeah.
So the first is like heroes, exemplars, elicit respect for the drama of life that involves suffering. And there's no meaning there's just no good story without suffering. So if you ask anyone, what's your favorite movie or book? And then you say, let's look at the plot. If you try and eliminate suffering, you eliminate all drama, and then the story is flat.
Yeah, you don't
And
take
yet we
out
don't-
the third act crisis,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the turning point of everything.
Yeah. And lives are similar, very much so. Our lives are a story, and there's this beautiful video of a woman who was dying of cancer, and she was speaking out about why she would not seek assisted suicide in the U.S. And she put it so succinctly when she said, how a story ends changes the meaning of every page. How a story ends changes the meaning of every page. So it matters so much that we live well until the very end. There's a great story that I love in the Bible about the martyrdom of Eliezer in Maccabees. And Eliezer is 90 years old, and the descriptions are amazing about his venerable old age and his wisdom and his just like the height of a kind of majestic old person. And he's being made by some king to eat pork, which is against Jewish law. And they're saying, well, why don't you just eat this and it will look like you're eating the forbidden food, but you won't actually be doing it. And in this way, you'll save your life. And he's like, no way. I'm not going to desecrate and denigrate my old age and the gray hairs that I've earned by, in a last moment, giving up everything that has been meaningful and important to me. And I would scandalize the young, and I would be so harmful So no way, I'm going to go instead and be martyred rather than betray the values that constitute the core of my identity. And I think we can apply this to the issue of euthanasia. Someone could say, well, why don't you just say that you died naturally, but instead take the 15-minute route out with medically administered death and just maybe tell your family that you did something different? Or no. The thing is, these acts matter. They are decisive. And it's so important that witness. So I love that story. I would honestly love to memorize it soon and to proclaim it, because I think that's such a sort of antidote to the minimization of the elderly and the witness that they give. That's partly why, and I'll probably say this throughout my time here, I love to address older people and say, I'm watching how you die. So do it well.
Do it well.
Right.
Yeah.
It matters. And if you think that it doesn't matter, then you've got to get out of yourself by thinking about someone else who is watching, even if they're not present to watch. And we also have to come alongside and actually watch and be attentive. And I do think that that's one of the most important things that people can do when they say, well, how can I address this person or go to this person who's thinking about euthanasia? I usually say, go to that person in whatever form, even a phone call, an email, whatever it is, and ask them in whatever way is natural to you. Put yourself in the posture of wondering, what do you have to teach me? Because when you wonder about the suffering person, when you wonder about the dying person, what do you have to teach me? A miracle happens. They will start to exceed themselves. They will become capable of a meaning and a purposiveness that they don't feel in their own inner reserves, because that's what transcendence does.
Yeah.
So I've seen that time and time again in all different contexts. And we just have to bring that posture of curiosity to elicit that from people. And also, to the point about children, I have heard the same thing from palliative care doctors, that the way that children in palliative care, pediatric palliative care patients, bear their suffering, even when they know that they will die, they are often more worried about their parents than their own death. They're worried about their siblings. They're really worried about mom and dad. Yeah. And that's such a common feature. And the parents are also, as palliative care doctors will say, kind of more the patient than their patient, because they have to take such care of those parents who are contending with the possible or impending loss of their child. Yeah. And that is a whole other work that they have to do. So just very, very interesting, but shows something about, unless we become like children and realize that death is that which we must pass through in order to get to the next thing, we cannot mature and grow up and become who and what we are.
A phrase that's resonating in my head as you speak is the idea that death is the last gift you can give.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Father Ron Rolheiser writes in a lot of the same line. Talking about what gift might my death be, and can my death be for those around me?
Which depends also, to an extent, on it being received. Because if we want death to, in any sense, be a meaningful gift, it has to be received in a meaningful reception. And I also think, there's a book by Henry Nouwen about our greatest gift as well, about dying. And again, in order to be a gift as we die, of course, every person is a gift in some fundamental sense. In order to be an extra special gift, we have to cultivate certain things within us to offer. And like Eliezer did, he had all these habits and virtues and strength of soul that he didn't want to shatter. Well, if your whole life has not been a witness, you can still make a gift of yourself and bear witness, but you've got to decide, what's that going to consist in? Yeah. What do I want to leave as the sign to the people?
Right.
Yeah. So you've been engaged in a number of these conversations now as your blog shifted from written form to spending time in conversation with these. What would be some of those conversations that stand out the most to you?
Yeah, I think there are so many. What's surprising is just how these conversations happen with Uber drivers, Airbnb hosts, customs officers, all kinds of casual
Anyone
settings.
who
So
asks
interesting.
what you're doing.
What are you
Exactly.
doing?
And the
Yeah.
reason is because, for example, I was taking an Uber in Ottawa, and this man asked, "What do you do for work?" And I said, "I prevent euthanasia and encourage hope." That's my answer every time.
Nice.
Because I figure it might be very likely it will be my only interaction with this person in our lives, in this
Yeah.
earth. So I might as well
Super succinct elevator pitch.
tell them a mission rather than.
I need one of those. Can we, after we're off air, can you help me
Draft a bunch.
craft
Absolutely.
an Uber answer?
Well,
Yeah.
come to the youth rally and maybe you'll get
There
it
you go.
there.
Yeah.
A personal mission statement. So I prevent euthanasia and I encourage hope. And this guy told me, well, my dad had MAID, he said. It hasn't even been a year. And I said, I'm very sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk about it? And he said, actually, I would. So he started to tell me about it. He said, my father was, in a certain sense, an ideal candidate for MAID. He had stage 4 terminal cancer. He was in a lot of pain and agony. My brothers and my mother all supported it. And it was able to happen at my home. The doctor came to our living room and did it. And so we had thought that this would be appropriate for him. And then he said that on reflection, though, he said, it's the most effed up thing in the world, knowing that your father is going to die in 7 days, then 5 days, then 3 days, and then in 15 minutes. And you're completely powerless. You just
Yeah.
know it's going to happen and you're a bystander watching it. Then he said, also on reflection, that he wasn't quite so reflective. I'm covering a bit of
Rough edges.
rough
Yeah.
edges, but he was very reflective in a certain sense because he was really opening up. And he said, my mother is traumatized about our living room. My mother doesn't go into the living room anymore because dad was killed there and she doesn't like it.
Yeah.
And so, okay. And then, so I was listening to this and I was thanking him for sharing. And then he had even more to say, which was very revealing. He said, my dad went to the doctor in November and he asked the doctor whether he might potentially make it to Christmas. And the doctor said to my father, there's a chance you could make it to Christmas, but if you do, it won't be a Christmas with you that your family will want to remember.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna say something
Yes.
angry. Has this doctor never been with a family that is with a dying person at Christmas ever in his life or her life? I don't know if the doctor's a man. I mean,
That's
these
yeah.
are. I'm
React.
doing my
No,
own
that's-
family. I'm trying to
yeah.
make right.
Yeah.
My brother died of cancer when he was 24. And those last moments, those last chances for a family to get together when you knew it might be the last time, he was in incredible suffering. And the idea that that would somehow be something we wouldn't want to remember is like literally disgusting.
Yeah.
It's one of the most beautiful things we have. We have a family portrait in our living room of pictures from that. And my brother looks sick in this picture.
Yeah.
And it's still incredibly beautiful. Anyway, and
Yeah. No, I think that's part of what gets missed in this distance that this artificial distance we're trying to create between life and dying. That whole process. My dad was at the end stages of COPD, just leading into my ordination. He wasn't able to get to my ordination. The week after, I was able to go and give him a blessing for Father's Day, and we've got a picture of this taking place, and it's the last picture I was able to take with my dad. And just even as you were sharing about the living room, when my dad died about a month later, I found myself in my mom and dad's condo. It was at the point where he'd had a heart attack. The paramedics had backed off, and we were just on the floor in their dining room, holding his hands. I was praying a rosary over him. I never once felt uncomfortable in that space afterwards. There was nothing uncomfortable
No,
and
it's
horrifying
beautiful.
about
It's
that.
holy.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are hard. Those are hard realities to see people carrying in their hearts. And I think it speaks to the repercussions that we aren't aware of because it's sold as an easy fix. It's sold as, we've talked about this before on the podcast, right? The easiest way to end suffering is end the sufferer. And then life can go back to normal.
Right.
But what we're realizing is it doesn't. When you've short-circuited that natural process of life and death, something awful happens. Yeah.
So we didn't bring any Kleenex
No,
into
we
the
didn't.
studio today, which was a bad plan.
That's going to be a new ad to the
we
podcast.
go to video, and I think this might be the first time I've cried on the podcast. We go
Yeah.
to video, but anyway, but let's say the point is, as soon as that man shared his story with you, I've never even met that man, but he shared something with you that you share with us and with our audience, and now we're crying.
Yeah.
Because his experience is not even, my brother didn't die by assisted suicide, but what that doctor said touched on something so fundamental to my own experience and then to yours,
Yeah.
right? That it speaks to the power of the ministry that you're doing to share these stories, because we all live the same kind of life. Like, these things will touch all of us, and that we could live in a culture where a doctor would say that this profoundly human encounter and reality is not something you would want. How unreflective do you have to be? Have you never been with it? You're a doctor. Have you never been with a dying person or a dying family that you could say something like that? Like, it seems to me like a purely ideological construct that ignores your own experience entirely, so that you can say some platitude to somebody. To what end? To like efficiency? What's the goal here? And anyway, okay, and rant. Okay, more story, but
That's okay.
it just.
Yeah.
It rattles me that way.
Yeah.
And that is the right reaction. These
I
are
think
the
so.
things of
That's it.
tears. And we've got to give each other permission to tap into what these experiences evoke. So that is exactly the right reaction. And to the extent that we're not having the reactions of being shaken and moved with this kind of pathos, that would be the weakness.
Yeah.
But the reaction is just and right to these injustices that we see. And for this man who shared all of this, we were coming to my destination. He told me he hoped that I would not give him a low star rating. And I said, most certainly not. He got
For the
5 stars.
conversation.
6 stars, 7 stars.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then at the end, he said, I've never talked about this before.
Because we're not allowed to.
Yeah.
And because the story that he felt compelled to tell himself about this event was one that trapped him in an inability to grieve, to be moved, and to reckon with the reality of that which he had suffered.
Yeah.
And all of us have the capacity, by bearing our own woundedness, by sharing our own losses, as we're doing here, and as will happen throughout this week of Encounter, as we do this, it just creates such an incredible communion. I love the quotation that compassion is a communion in suffering of those who love. And we've got to, even if your story is different from someone else's, and it will be, because people are unique and unrepeatable, as John Paul II put it. Obviously, we don't all have the same experience. And yet, that loss, unique as it is from your brother, the loss of your brother, it still becomes a basis for communion in suffering of those who love. And that's remarkable. And we see concretely, and this is why the work has to be not only through technology, but also in person.
In person. Yeah.
Because it's different. Obviously, the way that we share face-to-face is different. And also, to pick up on this point of how shattering it is to hear that anecdote, these judgments on the value of life cannot but affect others. Many people would say, don't like euthanasia, don't get
Don't do it.
euthanized.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've heard that kind of language before. It doesn't work because as soon as you say, and there was a doctor actually, this was last week, a Canadian doctor with 100,000 plus followers on X said that if he ever gets dementia and is not able to get treatment for it or reverse the decline, he would like to seek MAID. And this doctor has a huge platform and tons of credentials, and he cannot say that without consequence.
Right.
That devalues every person living with dementia who are not able to push back because there are not that many people with dementia on Twitter or X these days.
Right, yeah.
And so what about that? What about all of the people whose voices we're not hearing? A friend and fellow podcaster put it starkly the other day where she said, well, the dead don't talk. So we're not hearing about the victims of euthanasia, and we're not hearing about so many others who are victims of what Pope Francis calls throwaway culture.
Yeah.
And so you cannot make a judgment on the value of life in this categorical way that doesn't devalue everyone who fits the category. That's why whenever there seems to be a rationale, because criteria makes it seem rational, the fact of having criteria, but in that cold rationality of having a criteria, everyone who fits the criteria qualifies to have a premature death, which makes their life regarded as less worthy of life and of living. That is a huge thing that we heard on Parliament Hill all throughout the Bill C7 debate over the expansion of euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness. We heard, although it was during the pandemic and so many of these voices were also eclipsed and not heard as loudly as they deserve to be, many people with disabilities saying, especially that track 2 euthanasia. So in Canada, we have track 1 and track 2. Euthanasia, sending people to their deaths. And track 2 is for those whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable and yet who are suffering grievously. And so really people with disabilities. And so people with disabilities are saying, in an effort to make death an equal opportunity for us, you have put a unique target on us. And some people will say, okay, so we don't have euthanasia for those with mental illness as a sole condition. This is a brief tangent on because your audience is up to this. This is a very dualistic way of looking at the human person, as if we can separate physical suffering from mental suffering.
Yeah.
If you are suffering physically and you are asking for MAID, you have a mental health challenge. You may not have a mental illness diagnosed, but you undoubtedly have some degree of suicidal ideation. That is a form of mental health distress that deserves to be attended to and met with treatments, interventions, love, and support. And yet we are compartmentalizing these and saying that you can suffer purely physically or purely psychologically. It just does not happen. We are body and soul. And so back to how these issues are a basis for re-evangelization, they're also a basis for restoring a correct anthropology, a correct view of the human person. And I was about 20 years old when I first learned that John Paul II had said in the encyclical Centesimus Annus that the fundamental error, and he was talking about socialism in this case, of socialism, is anthropological in nature. It gets the human person wrong. You can insert any ideology, any ism, and any dehumanizing bioethical practice and say the fundamental problem of euthanasia is actually anthropological in nature. It gets the human person wrong. We attempt to compartmentalize the will and the body, the mind and the physicality, and we just can't. These are so inextricably woven together, and I actually think we can re-enchant the world with the truth about the human person, body and soul, by facing up to the reality in experience of how much these are inextricably linked. And so now, yes, we have euthanasia staved off until 2027, technically, for those for whom mental illness is a sole condition. But the law still passed in 2021. That law passed then. Then there was a sunset clause to delay it for 2 years. Then it was delayed until 2024. But the law passed. And so we have to be so vigilant. But also, I want to make the point that if you are someone who uses a wheelchair and you are depressed, you qualify for euthanasia. But if you're only depressed, You don't. And that clearly shows the devaluation specifically of persons with disabilities. And there's so much work to do on this. There's so much work. Everyone listening, pick a piece of the puzzle to attend to. Maybe it's listening to the stories of loss and grief and creating a space in conversation. Have conversations about the people. Everyone has had people die in their lives.
Yeah.
And partly my blog, what I loved is I would go to people and I'd say, I need to write a blog for Dying to Meet You. Tell me about a death in the family. And actually that question, going around and saying, tell me about a death in the family, never once in my life has that question been shut down. Never once has someone not wanted to share. They might be a little hesitant. It might take a little time to warm up. It might be the first time in a long time they're returning to this experience. But everyone wants to share these eminently human realities. So create space and invite people. And the only way that you can really do it is by giving an opening in your own sorrow and grief, because that's what gives people permission. Usually I speak about these topics so to be an access point and an entry point for people to feel free to recognize the realities in their own life and to begin having conversations. That's my hope.
Yeah, 100%. That's so much a part of the mental health ministry that my wife and I are involved in, specifically creating spiritual peer support groups where we can create spaces for people to share their sufferings, share their joys, to walk with each other as kind of the wounded walking with the wounded together. But there's such a healing value in speaking out loud to other people what's the weight that you're carrying within yourself in that. And I think it's social media has become too easy of a forum for us to do that at a distance without reference to the other. That breaking that down and encouraging people to enter into those one-on-one conversations with each other.
And this is the incarnation. This is the heart of our faith. This is that God wants to enter into the grit and reality of our life, of our suffering, to accompany us, to taste all of these experiences. And so part of asking what would Jesus do, part of wondering how we can follow Christ is, how can I enter into the incarnation where I'm willing to enter into the muck of life, of grief, of sorrow, because this is our model. And it's so rich to think about all of these topics from the perspective of or in light of the Gospels. And this is, I think, a challenge I would give to people, especially who are very immersed in the faith and who have heard the Gospels throughout their entire lives and very familiar with the Scriptures. Is it becoming new in light of current issues, realities, and things like that? So, for example, when you throw a banquet, invite the crippled, the lame, the blind. Okay, what are we being told in this? And who are those people for us? When you have Thanksgiving dinner, are you inviting the person struggling with their mental health? Are you inviting someone who's just been widowed? Are you inviting, to attune ourselves to the kind of gospel instantiations in our own life and reality, and to let all of these episodes actually prompt and cue us, will be so enlivening for us. It will make the faith deeper, richer. It will make us hear every reading anew when we start mapping on some of these issues and crises of our time. And that's why I'm not afraid of this topic or these issues, not at all. Because as this poet, Rainer Maria Rilke says, have us challenges. There are challenges. They're our crises. We must kind of learn to love them because God is in the reality. Obviously, euthanasia is a grave evil and a very dark matter. And yet he wants to enter into the darkest of realities. And we can all be a light and dispel that darkness through our accompanying presence that is not afraid of any darkness. Blessed Carlo was not afraid to contend with the issues that his friends were going through and the people begging outside of the churches were going through. He had a real engagement with the needs of the world. And so let's not be self-protective. Let's not distance ourselves, but lean in to all of this, and we will have deeper, richer, more alive faith than ever.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. There's so much here.
I know.
I got.
We need to do like 4 more podcasts. That's
Well, we can do at least one more, I think. But a practical, a pastoral, and a theological. Practical, you said everyone take a piece, and if you're like, I have no idea what my piece is, here's the piece. If you have living parents and you haven't talked to them in the last week, phone your parents. That's like, and if you push a little further, who are you inviting to Easter dinner?
yeah.
When I go home to my parents, there's always some person. You never know who's going to be at Easter dinner at my parents' house because they will take in all
Whoever
these
has
people,
need,
right?
yeah.
There's wild stories we could tell about the people who show up at my parents' house for Easter. Second, the pastoral point. When we were doing diaconate formation, so many of the people, some of us went on to do care in care facilities. We all had to do internships there, and then we had chaplains who came and did presentations to talk about it.
Yeah.
Almost every chaplain I talked to said, I was terrified. I never wanted to do this. When they asked me to do this, I thought, I get you're going to go be with dying people every day. How do you even function? Won't this just run you over like a truck? Every single one of them starts with that.
Yeah.
And then says, this is the most life-giving work I've ever done.
Yeah.
So that's the pastoral. And then this leads to the theological, which is something like, the Eucharist shows us that communion in life starts in communion in death. That's actually the picture you get at every single Mass, is that this life and this community and this possibility for newness and whatever starts in a communion in death. And we say it explicitly, right? And that that's a theological idea that you can explore theologically, but also if you reflect on the pastoral experience and the stories, you're going to know that reality, you're just going to see that reality show. Once you have the words to label it, you'll see it show up in all the stories, in the pastoral care, the life that people find in the dying of writing a blog 365 days or what, and deciding to face it directly. The Eucharist is an invitation to face death directly, every day.
Every day. Yeah.
So anyway, let's have another. I don't know what our time is.
Well,
This
we're coming up to time now.
Okay, here's the proposal. Do we call time and then do another episode with another story or two, or do we have to be somewhere in a hurry?
We have to be somewhere in a hurry.
Okay, so let's do one last quick story then to wrap.
Okay.
Not for me, for
Any
you.
story?
Yeah.
Any story.
And another story, and we promise not to take the one story and turn it into an hour. We'll just let you tell.
I suppose I'll just share that last week I was in the States with a beautiful religious community called the Carmelite Sisters for the Aged and Infirm. And the fact that a community exists with this charism in the name is very beautiful, that they exist for the sake of these persons who in our country and in our society are among those at greatest risk of being discarded, dismissed, or discounted. And for a week, I, along with a couple other women, had the opportunity to serve alongside the sisters at a nursing home and at an assisted living place and community. And I spent most of the afternoons with people with dementia. And what I noticed in spending time each afternoon with these persons with dementia, many things come to mind. And one of them is one of my favorite quotations of John Paul II. He said, "The great achievement is to see the values that others don't see and to affirm it. The even greater value is to bring out of others the values that would perish without us. In this way, we bring our values out in ourselves and in others." With that prompting from John Paul II, from his teachings and from his life, I would go to these persons with dementia with this same posture of, what do you have to teach me? How is God going to reveal something about how he is with us and how we are with him in the encounter with these persons? And there was always something there. In even if something in a worldly way seemed like nonsense, I thought about how Jesus said, I thank the Father that you have revealed these things to the little ones and hidden them from the wise. Why would he say that? Why does he say, I thank the Father for that? Let's meditate on that. Why does Jesus thank the Father for the concealment and revealing that happens in this way? Basically, all I can say is that after that week with people with dementia, I too thank the Father that he has chosen to reveal things and to touch my heart through those people who I encountered and hidden them from the people who I may encounter in other settings. All of it is spurring me to try and encounter people from all walks of life with the same gaze toward me that these persons gave, with the way that they met me and affirmed me. It is so healing. It is that revolution of tenderness. It's a witness and a touch that we really cannot live without. I hope everyone can find these experiences and this revelation for themselves.
Wonderful. Gosh, thank you so much, Amanda, for spending some time here today on both of these wonderful podcasts that we've had, and for opening up these kinds of vital conversations for us. So I'm hoping that our listeners feel empowered to create spaces for these kinds of conversations wherever Christ has put you, to bear his light and bear his word in your own lives. And the website again is
dyingtomeetyou.com.
dyingtomeetyou.com. We will put that in the podcast description, where you can truly enjoy a host of other stories that Amanda has curated and created in that space as well. We're looking forward to this week with you here in the diocese, and we thank our listeners as always for joining us, and we pray that God may continue to bless you and those you love with a faith that is always seeking understanding.
St. Thomas and St. Ignatius,
Pray for us.
Amen.
Amen.